Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon to Grant Hildebrand's third lecture on the Gothic Cathedral, and today he will introduce us to the flying buttress. Grant Hildebrand.
Thank you, Anne. Someone left for me this magazine. Who was that? I'm not seeing a hand, but okay. It's a National Geographic publication, and it has a long article on the Gothic, but it's a very flawed article. Well, it really is. This is the caption is "The Origins of the Gothic," and the photo they show is the right side. It's Saint Denis, but it's the work of a century later in the choir, which has nothing to do with the origins, and it's full of that kind of thing. It lists none of the great French sites. It includes Siena, which has nothing to do with Opus Francoginum. I'm surprised because National Geographic is pretty much the gold standard for that kind of thing. I'm happy to return it to whoever brought it to me. Sorry, I didn't mean to be sarcastic. With thanks, with thanks indeed, but it is not an article that's up to the National Geographic standard by any means. Surprises me. The problems aren't just pedantic, they're really big ones. Last time round, we talked about Saint Denis and its real origins of the Gothic. The spire that was taken down, you'll recall, in 1840, and the site as we see it today, with at the east end of the ring of chapels by Suger's master mason, whom he fails to mention, glass and vaulting that mark the beginnings, really, of a new style. Why isn't it changing? There we go. And we looked at the first Gothic cathedral at Laon, northwest of Reims, in the northern Champagne region, on its mesa, with this, I think, grand facade. I like it so much, with its wonderful oxen and the towers that we looked at and discussed. And its interior, six-part vaulting, and its uniquely squared off east end, a change made during the process of construction. So, you've shown an interest in your discussions about questions of structure, and I included some illustrations, some images today to talk about that a bit because I think it does interest you. This is a drawing of the masonry only, without any of the wood construction, except that the draftsman has very oddly shown that bit of roof off that upper left that doesn't make any sense, but the rest of it, I think, may help you to see the masonry element of these buildings, although they never would have looked like this because the roof structure would have been built first to be the platform for putting up the vaulting that is so clearly shown here. But it does illustrate for you the geometry, I think, of the vaulting system, the relationship of the parts, so I thought I'd include it for its value in that sense. This is one of the drawings of a book by David Macaulay called Cathedral. Some of you may know it. It takes one step by step through the construction of a cathedral, and rather well done. He used to have all of his drawings available on the web. He doesn't now, it's just this one. But I included because it does tell us some things. You can see the foundations here extending well down into the earth, as they would typically have done in France. England is quite another story. And the walls that have risen with the roof structure built in over the side aisles shown, and then the formwork for the vaulting, the flying buttresses that you see are built. They have to be built on a form. They don't work until they're complete. They collapse until the last stone is in, as we'll see in the next illustration. But the formwork shown here. The one quarrel I would have with this drawing is that I think the walls would have been more fully braced. I think there'd have been a good bit of bracing going on, and they're shown here as rising just autonomously. And this drawing, which I like very much, I didn't think I could find it, and unfortunately I did. You see here the vaulting being built over the wooden formwork that supports it until it's complete. The arch nearest you, nearest the bottom, is complete. The keystone has been dropped in place, and they're raising the keystone to drop into that conglomeration of 4 ribs that you see. Can you make out the keystone? I hope you can. It's not easy to see. How did they do this? That keystone would have to be cut to a tolerance of 1 millimeter, because when you drop it in, you want it to fit. Yes, you do, desperately. And how is that done? They worked from what is called a tracing floor, in which they drew out on a plaster floor, they drew out these ribs in profile at full scale, and cut the stones working along that cutting floor as a pattern, and they would assemble. And then when you get to the apex, you measure exactly what you have in place, and you take that down to the tracing floor and impose it on the drawings that you have at full scale, and that will tell you exactly how you need to cut that keystone. Then you send that to the lodge, and the lodge does an exacting job of shaping a rather complex piece, and it drops in place, and there you are. If the lodge has done it correctly, and if not, there's trouble afoot. They show the great wheel up top there, but wrongly. The rope is attached to the outside of the great wheel, and of course you don't get any mechanical advantage out of that. The rope would have been attached to a much smaller drum-like assemblage on the axle itself, so that as you turn the wheel you gain an enormous mechanical advantage in lifting the heavy loads. I think they probably had 2 or 3 diameters to have a sort of a variance of a variety of mechanical advantages for lighter and heavier pieces. Then when that keystone is dropped, then you take the formwork away and the rib is complete. It is then at its weakest. I think I've told you that the stone hardens over time. It cures over time, and the building becomes more and more secure as time goes on. Its weakest moment is when that formwork is struck. What else can I tell you? You look down at the floor far below. There are people down there that you can see, and they're drawn, I think, fairly well in scale. The window that's shown over there is one that we're going to be talking about quite a lot, and I think I'll wait to describe that. I'm going to call it 2 lancets and a rose, but we'll discuss the reasons for my calling it that, I think, as time goes on. What else can we draw from this? I think that's a good drawing to show the construction. And maybe I should stop here and ask if there are questions about this drawing.
I just noticed the man in the wheel.
The man at the wheel, yes. In the wheel. Yeah, he would walk the wheel, and that's where you, of course, you need the leverage of having the rope on the axle rather than the outside of the great wheel. That would have been a typical device. This doesn't show a lot of the scaffolding and ladders and sorts of things that would have been appended to the thing as it goes up. There have been all kinds of subordinate platforms and bits and pieces. I also show, well, I'll cover that, I think, when we get to it, the doors that open at upper levels to allow circulation to these different parts. How do these people get up here? Newel stairs that are built typically into the buttressing the wall system, and again I'll show you those as we push on today. Yes. I can repeat your question, just talk to me. Yep. Are the stones mortared? They probably are given a light mortar wash just to make a completely intimate bedding. But they don't depend here much on mortar. By and large, they try to make the stone-to-stone connection. And it's just as well, because medieval mortar is not very good stuff. What little we've managed to salvage is poor material. I think just to make the surfaces intimately bed. Okay. You all know where we are. All right, imagine you do. Notre-Dame, Paris. This building, we think, was begun in 1163. We're not quite sure. The document that gives us a date says, "And the bishop visited the site of the new cathedral in this year." Was it already well under construction, or did it not yet start until several years later? It's not quite clear, but the assumption is that that is the date that the work began. And it began as a very, very large structure. My button isn't working very well. Why is it not? Yes, the view from the park. This will be familiar to many of you with the grand flying buttresses, which are not by any means original. This building has a complicated history, and I'm going to talk you through the complexities of it. The west facade. This is a facade of considerable interest. It came on the scene as probably one of the late stages of the construction. The building began in 1163, and we know it was completed by about 1220, something like that, and then radically remodeled in 1250, and I'm going to talk us through those different phases. The three portals here that we saw at Long, leading into the aisles, but in this case, two side aisles, not one, in those side portals. The Gallery of Kings above, and then the rows and the towers. These towers would have been intended to have spires, which they never got. I've told you these buildings were never quite completed. This is one case, one instance of that. The growth in size, you see the section of Long here on the left, and next to it is Paris. Long is 65 feet to the key stones of the nave vaults. Paris is 110. Much wider. There is 4 times the masonry here at Paris that was laid up at Long. Enormous gain in size and in the working teams. This would have been the establishment of what we might call a cathedral building industry. We're getting a workforce here of much greater size than was in place at Long, much greater building. It will grow yet more. You see Chartres there to the right of Paris. The plan. Simple, straightforward plan. 5 aisles, 2 on each side, and a central volume right the way through. The chapels that you see at the edges of the thing that make it look like it's actually 7 units across were later additions. They filled in actually, so the deep buttresses that were the side feature of the building. You see here a 6-part vaulting system planned out for you, and the turning of the chevet, very simple in this case, no protruding chapels. just the ambulatory swinging around, double ambulatory with that little bump of a central chapel. I want you to remember one element of this plan because it's going to have some importance in our next building. You see the nave that has the 6-part vaulting, and because of that, the vaults are even in number, 2, 4, 6, 8, so forth, because the 6-part vault demands paired bays. Do you follow that? Yeah, say yes. And then in the choir, an odd number of bays, because there the last sexpartite vault is just half of it, and the half to the right is those lines that sweep around to vault the chevet. I hope you're following that. So an even number of bays in the nave and an odd number in the choir is demanded by a 6-part vault system. The west front here you see very heavy construction. The rest of it beginning to be an armature of lines or points rather than wall surfaces and planes. The original scheme was much simpler than what we now see. It was built as what you see here on the right, on the left, as a scheme that was hardly buttressed at all. And as the As the scheme progressed, it was necessary to invent the flying buttress. The scheme is one of 4 stories. You see here on the left, Paris, a nave arcade, then a gallery of some considerable dimension, and then those odd round window sorts of things above, and finally the very small glass, the small window up top, and it shows you the 6-part vaulting, an elevation of that. This will change in Chartres quite considerably as you see the view up next right. 4 stories. Yes. And when Viollet-le-Duc did a considerable restoration of Notre-Dame after its many changes in the course of its history, he restored the 2 bays. You can see them just there at the crossing with the little round window and the little tiny clerestory window above. Those are the way that the whole thing originally was. But when it was, I really shouldn't be showing this one right now. Let's go, well, I'll talk it through with this one. When the nave was well along, the vaulting in place, it began to show cracks. The masonry, as I've described to you, shows you what is happening in it. It began to show cracks on the outer surface. The system was collapsing outward, and props were put in place as expedient support against failure. It was a quarter arch that was put in place to prop the thing up, and from there on the rest of Notre Dame was built with those props in place, and we have here then the original flying buttress, the first instance of the flying buttress. Then sorry, I'm out of sequence here. Then, as the workmen put down their tools along about, I suppose 1215, 1220, Chartres had begun to take shape. And it was clear that Chartres was playing a very different game with the windows and with light. You can see here the 2 compared Paris on the far left and Chartres next right. That glass, that upper glass at Chartres, has 6 times the area of the window at Paris. And Paris, as the capital, had to do something about this. It was clear that they were much overshadowed by the scheme at Chartres, and they did. They changed it to what I showed you in that view. You see here, in all but the little round windows, the bays next to it, that the windows have been much enlarged, about 1250, just after Chartres had made its case for the expanses of glass. About 1250, and with that came those dramatic flying buttresses that are such a wonderful feature of the present scheme. This is the little model that I have up here on the table. I made it some years ago and thought you might be interested, but it shows us some things that are harder to show in the real situation, and so I brought it and these pictures of it. There we go. One of the things it's told me when I put it together was that the flyers of 1250, the late dramatic flyers, don't rise to the same point in the choir as they do in the nave. I'd always assumed they were the same, but the ones in the nave, as you see them here, rise almost to the cornice, and the ones in the choir are lower down, well into the paunch of the vaulting. I'd have thought the ones in the choir were the right way to do it, but it's stood all these years without my advice. This may show you also the interesting buttressing around the chevet, around the east end. The flyers radiate, of course, as they have to with that plan scheme, and so the distance widens as we get closer to the edge of the chevet, and subordinate buttresses are shoved in there to pick up the inner aisle. You can perhaps see them between the larger flyers in this model, and again, somewhat better, I think, perhaps, than in actuality. Interior. The nave arcade and the gallery and the later much enlarged clerestory. Yeah. Notre-Dame in its present state. The 6-part vaulting here clearly seen. Also, in that 1250 reworking that did the flyers, the dramatic flyers, the transepts were reworked to make, I think this was probably the real competition with Chartres, where they could almost start again. The transepts were pushed outward slightly from the outermost edges of the scheme, and were given these enormous roses and line of lances, a sequence of lances. This is beautiful glass. They, I think, meant to rival Chartres, and they did. Yeah. The southern rose. This is evident on the exterior. It's a really very handsome feature of the facade toward the river. You have all seen it, I'm sure, and reacted to it. It's a beautiful thing inside and out, and it really graces the river side. It's a wonderful element in this scheme. This, by the way, shows the flyers rising to the cornice in the nave and down somewhat in the choir. Then came the revolution and damage to the building. It was, after all, the royal cathedral, as was Saint-Denis, the Basilica. The Gallery of Kings that is above the three portals here was badly damaged. The kings were beheaded, disfigured, and much else. And in the mid-19th century, the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc did an extensive restoration yet again of the building. He recarved, recut many of the king's gallery figures and spiffied up a good bit of the portals, which also had been badly damaged. And he rebuilt the spire. Oh, I'm sorry, yes, I should have mentioned these. These are famous touristic pictures of them all the time. They are 19th century, they're not original at all. This is all Viollet-le-Duc's work. He restored with rather an imaginative hand Viollet's figures. They're charming, but they're more modern than the building. And he did the spire. There had been a spire here, but a much smaller one. Viollet thought it should be much more dominant, more dramatic, and he built it as such. And then, if you see the crease between the transept and the choir, you can see that there's a little something going on there. There's something in the crease. That's a series of figures, the topmost of which is Viollet portraying himself, gesturing at the spire. He wanted to announce himself as the architect of the restoration, and who's to blame him? He did a job of it, and there we are. The spire, of course, was one of the things that was so badly damaged in the fire, destroyed in the recent fire. The building then exists as the most famous, I suppose, of the Gothic cathedrals in France. People know this more than almost any other. Chartres, I suppose, would be the next on the list of popularity. It's a marvelous piece of urban sculpture, and I think that's one of the great roles it plays. The interior is inferior, I think, to much that would follow, but the exterior has a drama, especially in those 1250 flyers, that is really just about unmatched. Yes, we view it here from the park.
Why did they put that big spire up?
I'm not getting any response out of this thing. What am I doing wrong? There we go. No, I want to go backward. Yeah. Question why that spire, just the drama of the thing. It had been there in the beginning, but much smaller, and Viollet enlarged enormously. So it exists, I think, as a marvelous piece of urban sculpture, remodeled many different times, and different with each remodel, complicated history, but it is a grand element of the city, and who would want to be without it? Well, the revolutionists were, they wanted to demolish the thing, and who was it? Someone stepped in. I think it may have been Viollet himself who stepped in and said, no, this really can't happen. It mustn't be. So we have it still. Now, I'm changing our schedule just a little bit because I want to I want to introduce you today to Chartres. I'm going to talk today about just its factual story, just the facts of the building. That will leave us free next time out to talk about some puzzles and their solution, and to vicariously walk through to and through the building, about which I have a good bit to say. So we turn to Chartres. The West Front. This has a good many different bits from different times. The portals, as you see here, are smooshed into the single volume of the nave rather than including the side aisles. The side aisles are ended in the tower bases. The three portals, the tower bases, and the three big lancets above are worked from the time of Suger, about 1150. Early work. Above them is the huge rose window that dates from about 1220. That is the end condition of the later body of the building that I'm going to introduce you to in a moment. The two towers, the tower on your right is work of the Suger's time, and the tower on the left is from the 1500s, very late in time. The tower on the left was done by Jean de Beauce, a local man. And as you see, it doesn't match at all the other tower. People wonder why. The tower on the right had originally sprung from a point at about the midpoint of the rose window, which, as I've tried to explain to you, came in later. The south tower then rose free from those open lancets right up the way. And Jean de Beauce wants to claim that same kind of freedom for the base of his tower, which pushes it higher. But in trying to relate it to the much older tower, he has tried to make it much lighter, and I think he's done so. His reasoning is, to me, interesting and I think convincing, but it does yield this oddly asymmetrical facade that puzzles many people. Then, June 10th of 1194, a fire broke out in the town, and it badly damaged the then existing body of the cathedral. Chartres was renowned as the possession of the relic of a tunic that supposedly Mary wore at the birth of Christ. How that got saved is anybody's guess, but supposedly that was their possession. They paraded it through the town at least once a year, and they manufactured a lot of replicas as souvenirs for the town. It was a part of the town's economy. And with the fire, it was thought that the tunic had been destroyed. Much panic. It was interpreted as a sign that Mary was dissatisfied with the city and wanted to leave. 3 days later, the tunic was discovered. The cynic may say, well, that's about the time it would take to stitch up a replica, but shame on you for thinking any such thing. But it was essential to the economy of the town, and it was rediscovered. And the lesson that was taken was not that Mary wanted to leave, but that she wanted a larger, more beautiful home. And that was the inspiration for one of the great buildings of Western civilization. What was it? This is the body of the grand building, with the west front evident, of course, there at the left. Come on, do it my way. very different plan from Paris. Very different, isn't it? Single side aisle in the nave, 2 side aisles in the choir, 2 ambulatories serving a sequence of 7 chapels, 3 of which are dominant. Big transepts, big porches to north and south. That compass rose, by the way, is off. The Chartres lies at 45 degrees to the cardinal points. Strange orientation and unique to this building. But now you remember what I said about the vault numbers for a sexpartite vault, that you need an even number in the nave and an odd number in the choir. Here we have an odd number in the nave and an even number in the choir. The first master who laid out this plan committed future masons to a 4-part scheme. This could not have been done as a 6-part design. He has made a commitment to that simpler and I think more satisfying 4-part nave vaulting right the way through. What did I want to say about that? I lost my train of thought. Yes, and the 3 bays in the transepts, so that there are 2, that he is committed to a 4-part scheme, right through, all the way through. The section, I'm sorry, I don't know why this isn't working better. Yeah. You see here that it's not a lot higher than Paris. Paris again on the left and Chartres next. Paris was 110 feet, Chartres is 125, a little higher, but not a huge difference. But look at the difference in the size of the elements. At Paris, you are impressed with the size of a very large building. At Chartres, you take a deep breath and stand tall. The elements are grand in a way that Paris cannot approach, a grandeur. And again, that clear story that is 6 times the glass of what Paris had been. This is a nave elevation that marks out the future and is very different from Paris in its intimation of scale, its sense of grandeur. It is the first building to use consciously as a design device the flying buttress. Seen at Paris, here seized for what it can do. This, of course, before the rebuilding of Paris with those dramatic flyers. The left is, again, a view of the side wall of the nave. The middle drawing is, I think, a very beautiful drawing of a section through Chartres, the nave, in which the flyers have that odd arcade in them, arcade of, you might notice, round arches, not pointed. And then over on the far right is the exterior view. You will note here also the window pattern, 2 lancets and a rose. And that is going to be with us now for a long time. It seems to be the way that the clear story wants to be done. The rose, of course, is round, and the arch over it is round. So this is not entirely a pointed arch scheme. 2 lancets and a rose, taking up almost, as you see, almost half of the height of the interior, and the buttressing. You see the buttresses with the arcade in them, and then another arch, another buttress above. What is the point of that? We think that that was to answer to wind loads coming from the opposite side, wind loading against the roof of the upper wall to stabilize the upper reaches of the structure. section through shot of the nave. The choir is different as it had to be since it has two side aisles, not one. It's a diagrammatic drawing. I'll just let you look at it for a minute. The interior, you see here the four-part vaulting, the nave elevation, the two lancets in a rows in the distance through the arcade, blind triforium, pointed arches, pretty much throughout, but not overarching the roses of the clerestory. And the transepts with these wonderful wheels of light. These are the flyers of the choir, and they are different. I'm not sure you can see them well. They are so complex. Let me try another view. No, that won't help us. This is the nave, and you can see here the round arch over the rows at the top of the clerestory. Yeah. Maybe this will help you to see the choir. The choir also has the arcade, but this arcade in the choir is a pointed arches and is a much lighter sort of thing. We'll be talking about this next time out because this is one of the assumptions that the choir was done later than the nave. The buttresses are sort of more modern, one might say. Yeah, there you can see the more open pointed arcade in the buttress. I brought this too to show you. I had mentioned that there are doors sometimes that open to nowhere. Here are two of them in this buttress in the choir, just as we're getting toward the chapels of the chevet. And these, of course, were to admit material into what was a newel stair beyond. The newel stairs that happen within these spaces are the circular things that go up within them, and these stairs feed the newel stairs, or these doors feed the newel stairs in that buttress. I should have mentioned too, and I missed it, the three protruding chapels of the plan. I want to go back to them because there's some importance. If I can go back to them. Maybe I can. Well, all right, I'll use words. The three prominent buttress chapels in the chevet are a consequence of the earlier scheme that had three very deep chapels, very strange plan. And when the building was rebuilt, I'm going to go back to that plan because there are a couple other things I want to say about it if I can get back to it. Those three prominent chapels are the consequence of three very deep chapels from a single ambulatory of the earlier plan. And they are built on those foundations, and the more subordinate chapels are on new foundations, as is the rest of the building. And I make that point because some authors will say that the plan is just a consequence of the foundations that existed from the old burned and demolished building. That is not true. The buttresses, the outer walls of the nave are outboard of the old foundations, and the bays do not align. One author that makes the point that it's built over the old foundation says the plan was inevitable. That isn't true. The bays do not align with the earlier scheme, although that author says they do. They are misplaced. This plan is original to itself and not a direct consequence of the pre-existing scheme. And if I had the right picture to show you, and I don't, I could show you the misalignment of the bays between the lower crypt and the main floor of the building. Much of this is on bedrock. There is a crypt below it, cut into the bedrock, that has a role to play in the preservation of the building, and we'll talk about that next time around. What else do I want to say? I think that's where I want to leave you in preparation. I wanted to give you a sense of what the building is, and then we'll talk about what the building means next time around. Yeah, thanks. I'll be glad to entertain questions.
Okay, we have time for some questions, and we'll be sending the mics around. You want to get up and are there any questions? Oh yeah, here's a question over here.
Yes.
Grant, question on the mortar. In later years, the Romans developed much improved mortar, which led them to adventurous designs in Villa d'Este and others. Did the Gothic cathedral masons ever catch up with that quality of mortar?
Not that I know. The Romans had used concrete, as I'm sure you all know, and Vitruvius actually sets down the entire formula for it, and Vitruvius was known throughout the history we're talking about. He said, he told us how to make concrete, and that was not really revisited until the 19th century for strange reasons. But the medieval mortar varied a lot from what Vitruvius described as Roman usage. I don't know the exact differences. I did at one time. I think they used a lot more sand and gravel and hardly enough of the Portland cement, the fired lime. But I think that's the best account I can give. Does that answer what you were asking? No, yes, no, yes, okay, all right, yeah. But I'll say it, many of you may not realize, concrete is about 1/5 Portland cement, and the remainder is sand and gravel, carefully screened, and water, and it becomes a hard and strong material, not through drying, but through curing. It goes through a chemical process of curing, and like the masonry of these buildings, it never stops becoming stronger. We measure its strength typically as a 30-day strength, but it will continue to harden well beyond that and into infinity. Sorry, who wants to?
Were there previously churches on both sides? Were there previously churches on both these sites?
No, at Paris the foundations are new. That was a community of buildings. The Parvis that lies before it now holds the foundations of a number of buildings that were there in what is now open space. And the cathedral itself was, the site was cleared of buildings that existed that were not churches at all, or well, some were churches, but they weren't cathedrals by any means. So there were buildings on the site, but not cathedrals, not a cathedral at Paris. At Chartres, yes, It was a church whose west front we still have in part that was burned and made way for the new work.
So is that unusual at Notre-Dame?
That we have a new site?
Yes.
Yes, it is actually. Most of the sites are buildings over previous foundations. The one kind of interesting exception is Beauvais. I'll show you that next period after next. Beauvais is the largest, the highest of all the French Gothic work, and it is fronted by the Carolingian Cathedral, which is hardly noticeable. It's just a tiny little thing sitting there. And so those foundations have no relationship at all with the Gothic building. But yes, in France, quite often we're building on old foundations. In England, almost all the time, we're dealing with Saxon or Norman foundations, you know.
Thank you.
You know.
Okay, here's a question. Over here. Raise your hand, Young.
Would you be comfortable using a laser pointer in your talks? I have a hard time sometimes finding.
Yeah, I know you do. And I can do that. My problem is that I can only use it for one of the screens. So there's a kind of favoritism involved. Yeah, I'd like to do that. I know that it's difficult for you sometimes to follow my attempts at describing a location. I'll talk with Reese a bit about what we can do about that. I know that it's a problem. Yeah. You know, I've tried to be clear, but I know it's a problem. Yeah. What's happening? Castile.
Were the purposes of the chapels determined at the time of the design, or were they just simply designed into the cathedral and then the purposes were determined yet later?
Yeah, the latter. Yeah, they were architecturally necessary and liturgically awaiting a patron, I suppose. Yeah. At Chartres, there was the added Chapel of Saint-Pierre, which is a really major projection at the east end, but that's later. That was from the 1400s. But yes, you can see at both, well, at Paris, you know, you make an end of the building and then you use it, and likewise at Chartres. Yeah. Yes. Hello, we got a question up here. Yeah. Hello.
I wonder who paid for all this in the beginning. I know the people contributed money, but they weren't very wealthy. So who paid for these huge structures?
Yeah, I can't answer that very specifically. We don't know a lot about it. I suggested that the wine was what had made France a wealthy nation. Its export revenues were major, and where there's money, it finds a home. But how that happens, I don't think I can tell you. I don't know who donates what. At Chartres, there was the local economy, the tunic business, that probably much of that went into the cathedral, but I don't really know. I can't tell you specifically other than in generalities, you know. Yes.
Here.
Hello, I'm over here. Because I was overlapping Chartres with a castle, the name of a castle that I knew, but then that led me to think about at the same time that these were being put up, were there also castles in France, for example, that were interesting and important architecturally?
Oh, yes, yeah, that's a whole other story, but yes, indeed, Chateau Bayard and the Welsh castles, Carnarvon and Conway. Yeah, there was all that kind of thing, much of that going on, yeah, and yes, indeed. The original master mason at Saint Denis came from a military practice, yeah.
I just wanted to echo someone brought up using a laser pointer, and I thought this for the likes of us who don't know the terminology like the back of our hands, it's so helpful. I just thought that was great.
I'll try to do something about that. I understand the point. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Here's fine. Do you have any questions over here? There's one over here.
Can you tell us about the workmen? Did they go from cathedral to cathedral or cathedral to castle? Or can you give us any idea about their peregrinations?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about that actually as the first item of business next time around, but I can give you a preview. The teams were itinerant. They would sign on to, for example, work at, let's say, Chartres, but the funds at that church were probably good enough for a couple years of work, and the team would sign on for a couple years, and then before too much time had passed, they'd sign up for a subsequent term of work at some other site, Lens, for example. Because they had to payroll, they had to keep going, and there wasn't any promise that there would be further work at the original site. So there was a good bit of wandering about. Typically we find that a team will stay at a site for anywhere from 3 to 5 years, seldom longer, and that pertains right the way through our story in both France and England. Yeah. I'm going to be talking in more detail about that in the context of Chartres, because it was there really that whole itinerant story was spelled out by the work of an Australian architect named John James that I'll be talking about next time. Yeah.
Well, we have time for one more question. Is there anyone who has a last question? No? If not, thank you so much, Grant. That was a marvelous lecture.
I look forward much to next time around. We get to enjoy Chartres and for all its richness, and we'll just wander about, and I look forward to that very much. Bye-bye.